My name is Guy LaMothe. I am Vice President of the LGBT plus Archives Project of Louisiana. I've been on the steering committee to host this event this weekend. It's going wonderfully well, and we're very pleased that you all are here in attendance. I'm also a retired Unitarian minister, serving here in New Orleans in the late 90s, early 2000s, overlapping with the ministry of Reverend Dexter Brecht, who was with MCC here at that time as well. So I'm really glad to be here. I guess that gives me the credentials to speak to the other religious on our panel, and I'm honored to do so. I do want to briefly introduce our panel, starting with the Bishop Paul Breton, who hails originally from New England and for over 60 years has been advocating for the LGBT plus community, beginning in the 1960s with the Mattachine Society in Washington, D.C., and leading to his political activism of the 1970s and the early fight against AIDS in the 1980s. In 1971, Paul founded and served as the first pastor of the Metropolitan Community Church of Washington, D.C., and in the immediate aftermath of the Upstairs Lounge arson, he co-founded the National New Orleans Memorial Fund, which I hope we'll hear more about in our presentation. So thank you for being here. Next to Paul, we have the Reverend Cory Sparks. He is the former pastor of St. Mark's United Methodist Church. He helped plan the 45th anniversary commemoration of the Upstairs Lounge fire. An ordained United Methodist minister, Cory holds a Master's of Divinity from Southern Methodist University and a doctorate in American History from Louisiana State University. Cory has 25 years of experience as a fundraiser, community organizer, and organizational development consultant, and is currently the major gift officer at Dillard University, an historically black liberal arts college located here in Gentilly. Next to Reverend Sparks, we have the Reverend Lonnie Cheramie. Lonnie is a native of Lower Lafourche Parish and a lifelong resident of Southeast Louisiana. After receiving his Master of Divinity from Notre Dame School of Theology, Lonnie was ordained a priest in the year 2000, serving several church parishes around Houma and Thibodaux before moving to New Orleans in 2008, joining the Metropolitan Community Church as a member in 2014, and then being called by that membership in 2019 to become first their associate pastor, and in 2020 becoming their senior pastor, a position he fills to this day. And next to Lonnie, of course, we have the Reverend Ed Cooper. He is United Methodist Church pastor, along, as is his wife, Reverend Joe Cooper, is with us as well. He presently serves at St. Mark's United Methodist Church, located in the French Quarter, as well as Aurora United Methodist Church on the West Bank. And St. Mark's, after the arson tragedy, was the only church that would offer a public ecumenical memorial service. This was resided over by the Reverends Troy Perry and the Reverend Edward Kennedy of St. Mark's. And at the time, this gathering represented the largest public gathering for a gay cause in the city's history. So I want to thank all of you for being on our panel discussion today, which is on the very narrowly defined topic of the spiritual legacy of the Upstairs Lounge. And of course, that is a very broad topic and a lot of ways to approach that, from a personal level, from a congregational level, from a denominational level, of course, from a social, societal level as well. So you're not here to hear me speak. I'm going to start by allowing our panelists to share a few introductory words addressing this idea of the spiritual legacy of the Upstairs Lounge, whatever they care to share about that, and then we'll have some pointed questions going on, and at the end, a chance for your questions as well. So maybe I could ask Bishop Breton if he would like to share first.
I'm very glad that you're hosting this panel discussion. One of my earliest preaching assignments was in 1971. I was asked by the pastor of the 16th Street Unitarian Church in Northwest Washington to stand in for him on a August Sunday. And he told me to preach the way I would preach anywhere. So I stood up in the pulpit and I preached, and I all of a sudden overheard somebody in the congregation not be upset about the fact that I was gay, but I heard someone say, "My God, Myrtle, he's a Trinitarian." During the middle of the night, Troy Perry, the founder of the Metropolitan Community Churches, called me on Monday, the 25th of June, 1973, to let me know there was a fire in New Orleans and that 11 members of our church, the Metropolitan Community Church of New Orleans, died in that fire. And he asked me if, because of my work with the Department of Social Services in Washington, D.C., if I could come down here and provide what assistance I could. And I didn't hesitate. A wealthy gentleman who was a member of Metropolitan Community Church of New York City provided the cost for the airfare and provision for a room in this hotel. And I came out here and considered it a privilege to be of service to the people in New Orleans. The room that I had in the hotel, I could look out the window and I could see the window in the building where Pastor Bill Larson died. And that got me moving right there, that I had to be here. And so I was here. I stayed with everybody who came from outside for the whole week. And then I stayed for an additional 2 weeks, mostly to lend my shoulder to anyone who needed to cry. And there was a lot of crying. Not only from others, there was a lot of crying from me as well. So that's the purpose of being a minister. That's the purpose of doing our ministry. I have difficulty sometimes with people who are somewhat anti-religious, and in the gay community, there's quite a bit of that. The documentary by Robert Kamina shows some clips from newsreels, and in those clips, there are Roman Catholic priests at the fire, at the time that it was burning, giving last rites to people as their bodies were being taken out of the fire by the fire department. And that's the real ministry of being a Catholic priest. Archbishop Philip Hannon did not do his job, but those priests did their job when they were there at the fire. And that is what is most important. It's what the priest did. Politically, Philip Hannon could have done some other things. And I did say in Robert Kamina's video that after that time, Philip Hannon should have said, "I'm sorry." And he never did that, and it's a great regret on my part. I spent 3 weeks in New Orleans. I became aware of your weather in New Orleans, and I met some truly wonderful people. I went to the hospital every single day that I was here to see the patients in the hospital, each of whom died eventually. And one of the interesting events that stuck in my memory was not only each patient whom I visited, but one day I left the hospital and there was a beautiful young woman walking to the hospital holding her baby in her arms. And she asked me to bless her baby. And I reflected on that afterward and said, this is what I as a priest am supposed to be about. I'm here for when they die. I'm here for when they come to life. And so I was pleased to bless that baby, just as I was pleased to bless those who were dying in the hospital. So,
Very good. Thank you. And speaking of doing your job, the United Methodist Church, the Louisiana Conference of the United Methodist Church, was led by a bishop who did his job, Bishop Finus Crutchfield. I mentioned in an earlier panel that he was at the service and he was criticized for St. Mark's being opened to such a memorial. He wrote a clear message to the conference in the conference newspaper. I mentioned that also at the panel. Todd Rossnagel, the communicator, is here, and Chris Brown, an archivist at Centenary, speaking of the power of archives, found that message, and the Louisiana Conference posted it yesterday in order to remind us of the stand, of what it looks like to do your job. And for Crutchfield, we can talk more about him at some point, but for Crutchfield, it was all about his calling as pastor. And he said, I'm paraphrasing, if anyone needed reconciliation and peace in the midst of tragedy, it was those who were mourning the victims of the upstairs lounge fire. And he said, I could not, in good conscience, close the doors of the church to them. This is who we are. This is what we do. Funeral services, something that simple and yet so powerful.
So being a lifelong resident of South Louisiana, and I think I was 3 years old when the fire took place, I'd never heard about the fire. It was not something that was spoken about, and we've talked about that. But when I came to New Orleans, and I still hadn't heard of it until I was on the New Orleans Pride Board. And as a member of the Pride Board in 2014, 15, something in that area, they wanted to do a memorial at the site of the upstairs lounge fire. And that's when I began to, well, what are y'all talking about? I have no idea. And so learned about it. And then when I was Pride president in 2018, we continued that annual event. And then after that, the Crescent City Leatherman took it over. Becoming pastor of Metropolitan Community Church, and being a member of that church for some time before becoming pastor, members had talked about that the upstairs lounge fire identified the church for so long. And there was a moment in that process that they wanted to step away from that it wasn't just our defining moment, but that they were more than just that fire. And most of the people who, had either been in the fire or had been witness to the fire or knew people in the fire were no longer in the church community. So it was all new people who were there. And so that was kind of they didn't really talk about it a whole lot when I first joined. But since I was Pride president and on the Pride board, it became important to me. And so since then, we have reconnected to doing, services, and tomorrow morning services is going to be in honor of those who passed away. And it wasn't until I read or I met Bobby that I found out where Reverend Lawson was buried. I had no earthly idea. No one in the church, anyone in our church community did not know who's attending services. And so, for me, it was important to learn those things and to, the flower arrangement that we're going to have at church tomorrow will go to his graveside as he represents all 32 people for us. I know we had, and I'm going to be perfectly honest, I had no idea how many members of our church community died in that fire. I asked people, and they were like, I don't know, 11. I now know. For us, this event, or for me, this event is our All Saints' Day. It's our members who, lost their lives innocently. And I'm wearing red socks for martyrdom. They lost their lives. And so, for me, it holds a special place. Spiritually, I think it's something that defined our community, just as Katrina did and the AIDS epidemic did, defined our church community. And it was after each one of those that our church community had to rebuild. In some ways, I think we're like the Israelites who constantly are having to reconnect, recommit, start up again, and build up again. And for me, it's a defining moment in our church community. You know, not one that should be brushed under the rug. It shouldn't be who we are completely, but I think it's part of who we are. It's kind of like, you know, your great-grandparents and knowing their stories. You know, it's knowing their stories that gives us life about who we are. You know, and knowing that they, you know, worshipped there at one time. You know, the MCC worshipped in the theater part of the upstairs lounge for a period of time. And they would go after service on Sundays to the beer bust. And they were there that night because, and I learned this from Bombi's book as well, they had finally gotten window units for their double shotgun church that they had on Magazine Street. And so they were going to celebrate that. And it was that night, unfortunately, that they lost their lives. And so for me, again, it's something more than just a history moment. It's a moment of awakening for us. You know, and we're probably going to stop. You go ahead. We'll have other things to talk about.
As far as the spiritual legacy, for me, there are two aspects that really come to the forefront. One is, I've said it, and I've heard it said oftentimes, that St. Mark's was the only house of worship that opened its doors for this memorial service. That's not necessarily true. There was another space that would have hosted this service if it had had the space, Metropolitan Community Church. And I will not forget that, and I will rephrase how I speak that legacy. So I stand shoulder to shoulder with Metropolitan Community Church and what you represent. And hearing you describe it being your all saints, I get that. The second aspect of the spiritual legacy has to do with, I was asked just this morning, why is it important to have a memorial service? And so I thought for a moment, and then I'm so thankful I did this. I just read the bishop's opening prayer that he prayed on July 1st, 1973 at that first service. And he stood and he prayed. I'll try to do it justice, Bishop, but we are here to join with families and friends who are grieving and mourning, and we are providing a space for worship. Close quote. No generation puts a pause on mourning and grieving and loss. And so we continue to remember that moment, that horrific moment when so many lost their lives simply because of who they were. And so those are the two spiritual legacies that I'm holding on to this morning.
Well, we are blessed to have an eyewitness account of that first memorial service sitting here with us. And I was wondering, Bishop Breton, if you might be able to share some of your recollections of that day, of that service, anything you'd like.
I'm going to start off by saying something that I've been saying for many, many years that I hold on to, is that it is impossible to know where we are going to unless we know where we are coming from. And we need to make a record. I have taught people for many years, make a history of your life, put it in a 3-ring binder, and make sure it gets inherited from generation to generation in your family. For events of this sort, it was important to write the book. Robert Fiesler writing the book, Tinderbox, Johnny Townsend and his book, Clayton Dellery and his book. Those books are important. The video by Robert Kamina I have my DVD at home, and I watch it all the time. I keep playing it. It still affects me to this day. I was talking with someone on Friday, and we started talking about one of the persons who was in the hospital, and I had to stop talking because the tears were going to come out. So that legacy is still there. And I remember that first memorial service. I pray prayers of gratitude very often for Bishop Finis Crutchfield. What a wonderful, powerful man he was. And for opening up the doors of St. Mark's. Yes, it was a challenge for the Methodist Church to do that, and we see that even to this day, the United Methodist Church is still dealing with that challenge. But he opened up those doors. One of the most powerful pastoral leaders that I've ever met in my life. Reverend Troy Perry, the founder of the Metropolitan Community Churches, preached a very dynamic sermon. He comes from a good Church of God of Prophecy background, so he knows how to preach it as a Pentecostal. And that was very impressive. But someone that you wouldn't think would do something very well is Morty Manford. Morty Manford represented the Gay Activist Alliance from New York City. He comes from what I call a normal New York Jewish family. And Morty Manford considered himself non-theist. Basically, he was not an atheist or an agnostic. He just didn't have time to be concerned about issues of God because he was too concerned about issues of people. And he preached a short sermon during that service based on the prophet Isaiah. To this day, I have never heard a Protestant or Catholic or even a Jewish person preach about the prophet Isaiah as well as Morty Manford. And he was considered to be a Marxist, not a very well-liked person. He was a marvelous person, wonderful person. Unfortunately, he died of AIDS at far too early of an age. But I remember that sermon about the prophet Isaiah and how dynamic he was in what he believed to be the gift that Isaiah gave to the Jewish community.
Cory, you spoke this morning in our first panel about place and memory, and I wonder if you might fill that out a little bit more for us here.
Sure, and the importance of memory to faith.
Is that on?
I just did flu work. Can you hear me now? Yeah, let's keep the mic hot for a second here, all right? So memory is central to the Jewish faith and to Christianity. The communion service of the United Methodist Church, the Roman Catholic Church, do this in remembrance of me. And Reverend Cheramie reminded us that the Jewish people were a forgetting people, and we are a forgetting people. Even those non-theists are forgetting people. So to be reminded, and for me, it's particularly urgent to remember for two reasons. First, that the tears are not all gone. Not all gone, even when Bishop Breton and other eyewitnesses have left this plane. The tears come to people who'd never heard of this tragedy, but learn of it for the first time and recognize what Clayton Dellery talked about yesterday evening, that they could be killed because of who they are and who they love. And that's a trauma that continues. I often joke that James Baldwin, the novelist and essayist, is the patron saint of St. Mark's as a gay black man. And he talked about memory as a way of processing trauma, that it needs to be remembered. And mentioning the AIDS crisis, which I think is important. There are many who survived that fire who died in the AIDS epidemic. And anytime I speak to my elders are actually my peers, given my age, about that moment. They'll say, oh, he's no longer here. He's no longer here. Looking at photographs, the memory has to be preserved. It's life over the power of death, which is all too real. But from the perspective of a Christian or Jewish person, not the final word. And then place.
It's interesting how in medieval times people would undertake pilgrimages to specific holy places for them. And in a sense, year after year, with this commemoration, with this second line, this procession to a particular spot, there is a group of people making a pilgrimage in remembrance of this occasion. Yeah.
And I'm so glad that Reverend Brecht pushed for that plaque to be there. I walked past it yesterday after going to the lecture and stopped, and there was a couple there, not born when this tragedy occurred. They were standing and they noticed the flowers that were left there. And they had a quiet moment. I had a quiet moment as I thought. I just passed the Walgreens that Roger Nunes, we'll call him by name, went into to buy the lighter fluid, past that Walgreens, and then to that spot. And Bobby closes his book with a line about the changes that happened in 2003 when homosexuality was legally judged to not be a crime by the Supreme Court shortly after the memorial service. And he talks about the fact that at that place, at the corner of Iberville and Charters, that place where gay men at one time had to flee upstairs in order to have their identity, it was at that place now their names can be called. So to call their names speaks to their dignity and to the power of life and of God.
Thank you. Ed and Lonnie, you both serve congregations that have been directly impacted by the arson attack, the upstairs lounge fire event. You've touched a little bit on that, but what is that like for you as a religious leader serving a congregation that carries this memory and in some sense carries this pain forward? Can either of you or both of you address that?
For Metropolitan Community Church, it's been one of remembering, but also owning that truth of what happened and that it is ours. And y'all kind of touched on it in your panelist this morning, and we spoke about it last night. The woman who spoke up and said that it wasn't so much a gay event, but a human event. And I don't know what her intention was. I don't know what she was talking about. But in my mind, I immediately thought, when the secular world wants to cancel us, they don't speak about our humanity. They just speak about those people and what those people do or what they presume those people to do. And by reading the book, Tinderbox, and I apologize, I have not read the other two books, but I will buy them and I will read them. I didn't even know they existed. But in reading Tinderbox, those people whose names were on a plaque became human to me. And you saw their personal lives, and you saw, their background and some of their stories, and that's who we are. As church communities, we are a people. A church is a building, or as in CC's case, we move buildings pretty often. The building can pass, but the people and their story is what holds us and makes us who we are. And Metropolitan Community Church of New Orleans was one of the first 5 churches founded in the denomination, and we're on our 52nd year, and I'm still amazed at how many in the LGBTQIA community do not have a clue as to who we are, that we exist, or that anything is going on. And it just, I'm amazed. And, until I met MCC at the Pride Festival when I was on the Pride board, I had never heard of them either. So, it's part of my desire to for our name to be out, our name, so people do know our story, and know our legacy, which is so intimately connected to the city and to the upstairs lounge.
What St. Mark's involvement in integration, when Ruby Bridges integrated William Franz, and St. Mark's went public, taking a stand for integration, and the young pastor Andy Foreman even having his life threatened in such a way that even the FBI said, you will either move or die if you stay. St. Mark's took that stand on behalf of integration. That same fabric was woven into the life of this church when the upstairs lounge fire happened, and I think that it galvanized St. Mark's in her relationship with the gay community. Here's what I mean by that, and if I say something that is misconstrued, please forgive me ahead of time. I'm an ally. My favorite t-shirt that I got from Bourbon Pride and I wear all the time, my wife has one, I am straight and I don't hate. But I'm an ally. I don't pretend to live, I don't pretend to know what the gay lifestyle is like. But in reflecting on this moment in St. Mark's, in some ways it was our stone wall. Now, I've been told by several of my gay friends that the upstairs lounge fire was, for the gay community in New Orleans, a stone wall, or the stone wall, in that an oppressed people finally said, enough is enough. And freedom and hope surfaced and said, this is what we will fight for, because this is who we are. Just as a community of people confront their own stone wall, so does a religious institution need to confront its own stone wall. And for St. Mark's, I believe, and even further for the United Methodist Church and beyond, it was a pivotal moment, and the decision was made. This is where, here I stand, I can do no other. I will walk hand in hand, heart in heart, with my brothers and sisters in the LGBTQIA community. And so that's what we choose to live out at St. Mark's, right alongside our gay brothers and sisters.
Thank you. My next question I'd like to pose to Bishop Breton. After the arson attack, after your arrival in town, you and others created the National New Orleans Memorial Fund. Can you share more about that effort and the impact of that fund?
I'm not the one who wrote the checks, unfortunately, so I don't know too many details. We decided right away, because of the needs of the people here in New Orleans. There were people who were injured in the fire that had special needs, and there were people that had no resources to get buried, who died in the fire. And so Morris Kite, who founded the Gay Community Services Center in Los Angeles, suggested that we start a memorial fund for the victims of the fire here in New Orleans. And we put together that, the basic idea, subjected it to a relatively new newspaper for the gay community called the Los Angeles Advocate, which has now since then become The Advocate. And the Los Angeles Advocate offered to host that fund and control it for us, audit it for us. And we put that fund together, and we raised, if I remember correctly, $58,000 in that fund, which in 1973 was a lot of money. That was the very first time ever that an organization was formed, a funding organization was formed on a national basis to serve the LGBTQ community across the United States. That was the perhaps founding experiment for other funding sources to be developed later on. The Human Rights Campaign came afterward. They used some of the same principles that we did for founding that. We were able to account for every single penny that came in and that went out, where it went out to. We provided money for some funerals. We provided money for one of the persons who was able to leave the hospital but had to undergo treatment at home after hospitalization. The money was not given out willy-nilly. It was for real certified causes, and we were able to distribute it carefully that way. At the same time that we were receiving funds for the National New Orleans Memorial Fund, the local church was receiving money, and unfortunately there were some people, there was no pastor at the time, and someone got a hold of that money and did not do with it what should have been done. And it's not the fault of the denomination, it's not the fault of the church itself, it's just that for a short while there was a vacancy in the leadership of MCC New Orleans because of the fire. I got into trouble in the Metropolitan Community Church at that time because I was so caught up in serving the people of New Orleans that I got some of the people in my congregation in Washington, D.C. angry. We've already contributed, and are you saying we didn't contribute enough, So that's one of the problems that people have in doing fundraising for anything. We get sometimes accused of wanting people to give more than they can, but and I was guilty of that. I wanted people to give more than they could, but we did it, and I'm glad that we did it. Reverend Troy Perry came. Reverend Perry sent a video that's available here for this weekend. Morris Kite, the founder of the Gay Community Services Center, came. He's died since then. Morty Manford from the Gay Activist Alliance in New York City, he came here for that, and he died also because of AIDS. Reverend John Gill came. I'm not sure what happened to Reverend Gill.
He's still alive.
He's still alive?
He lives in Arizona.
Okay. And I came at that time also, and obviously I'm still alive here also. And we felt that our duty, our moral duty, to be of service to the people of New Orleans after the fire. And so that's why we all came. We didn't have the same consciousness of moral duty from the same point of start. Morris Kite considered himself a non-theist. Morty Manford considered himself a non-theist. Troy Perry was very much Christian. So we all came from the different perspectives, but we did recognize it as a moral duty, and it certainly was. I want to make one additional comment to that, to the side. Church is not necessarily found in a community of people who adhere to a creed. The beer bust on Sunday afternoon at the upstairs lounge was a church. You had people of like mind and like interest coming together every Sunday at a specified time. I'm sure that at St. Mark's you'd like people to be coming every Sunday at a specified time. And they were there at the beer bus. And they did something that people in church should do, and oftentimes in churches don't do. They were friends with each other. And they had an anthem. And every Sunday afternoon, at the end of the beer bus, they would stand around the piano and they would sing, "United We Stand." And they meant it. There are some churches who sing "United We Stand" and don't mean it. That church sang "United We Stand," and they meant it. That's as much church as St. Louis Cathedral is a church. That's as much church as St. Mark's is a church. That's as much church as the Episcopal Parish is a church. And they fulfilled that purpose, I think, to the T.
Were you aware, sir, that this was one of the first national organizations of its kind, organizing of its kind for the LGBT plus community across the nation to come together in support of a specific community cause here in New Orleans, and that this model of building alliances and support was later deployed with the AIDS crisis that was to emerge within the next decade. So a truly momentous occurrence around. It seems that out of the ashes of the fire, seeds of hope sprang, and these seeds bore their flowers and their fruit in later years. There's something about the ability of a house of worship to take from tragedy hope and a purpose moving forward. There was, of course, the response of many of the religious at the time, which we understand was negative and dismissive. And then there were those who stepped forward and understood their calling and the mission of their church. And we see over time how these attitudes amongst these different camps have evolved. But there's still criticism within the LGBT plus community towards organized religion. They point to instances such as the upstairs lounge arson and the official religious response by the Catholic Church and others after that incident. And of course, we could list a whole array of contemporary insults as well. What are your thoughts on addressing these concerns and these issues that are shared amongst the LGBT plus community towards organized religion? And either of you, any
Well,
of you, all
since I
of
have
you.
that mic, I'll go first, because my wife says I pastor 3 congregations, one on the West Bank, Aurora, one in the French Quarter, St. Mark's, and my favorite gay bar on North Rampart, American Townhouse. I walk in almost most Wednesdays. I wear my collar. I sit down. I order a gin and tonic, and I just sit. And invariably, someone will walk over, sit down, we'll strike up a conversation. I'll listen to their story, and I cannot tell you how many times this has been said. I want to tell you something, Father. They would call me Father. And I want to tell you something. I doubt seriously if you will ever see me in your church, and you probably know why. I said, I do. But every time they would follow with, thank you for being here and for listening. And so I just, as a matter of fact, some of you guys will remember Lil, who tended bar at American Townhouse. We did his funeral we celebrated his life at St. Mark's, all because of passing out a card, a patron calling and saying, you and I both know Lil never stepped foot in church, did not care about church, but he liked you. So could we celebrate his life? I said, absolutely. And we had an amazing service. And we closed with the theme of Golden Girls. And someone said to me, of course you close with the theme from Golden Girls. But that's what we do. We just, going forward, we love and listen and accept for who each person is.
I was going to say, I agree in many ways. A church isn't a building. It's the people. And I've taken upon, actually, I've had friends going, you wearing your priest stuff again to go to this event? And I'm like, yes, I'm wearing my priest stuff again. They need to see the priest at the event. And so it's kind of been my thing to indeed wear this, whether it be hot or uncomfortable at times, to go to the LGBTQIA events in the city and to be present. And just like you said, sometimes they come talk to you. Someone came for Mardi Gras ball because we were showing people where to sit for the Mardi Gras balls. If they walked in and said, we're at table, whatever, we'd say, it's over there. And one person walked up to me and said, so you're wearing a costume or you're really a priest? And I was like, I'm really a priest. So, it's just being where they are. Being where they are without judgment, being where they are to walk with them. And as a gay man, it's my journey, as well, understanding that, and I was a Catholic priest for 8 years. And I left because, that's when they were blaming all the gay people for all the wrongs that the Catholic Church was doing. And I was like, and then they said it's, an impediment to orders. And I'm like, so when I was grandfathered in, like, God was like, oh, it was okay then, but now it's not okay. And I was just like, this is stupid, and so I left to live my truth and live, who I am and know my faith and to be able to share that faith with other, LGBT members and allies is my goal and what I hope to do in my ministry. And I'll meet them on the street. I'll meet them. It's hot right now. We could go inside an air-conditioned building, but I'll meet them wherever they are, and that's the important thing.
The only thing I have to add is a word again from St. Jimmy Baldwin, boy preacher turned author. And he talked about self-deception and the dangers of self-deception frequently. It's a major theme of his novel Giovanni's Room, but a theme of his analysis of American society around race and sexuality. And for me, when I speak with my friends who are LGBT plus whatever stripe, and when I speak with folks I meet on the street who ask me about being a United Methodist minister, I'm reminded again and again that the United Methodist Church continues to restrict ministry. A self-professed practicing homosexual cannot be a United Methodist minister still, even as the conservative church has left. And Reverend Cooper and Cory, when he was in the pastorate at St. Mark's, could not perform a same-sex marriage. That remains. And it is a danger, as a close friend of mine reminds me, that we are asking LGBT people to be deceptive about who they are at their very core of their being. And that we all lose through that. It's not just LGBT people who lose, we all lose. And Baldwin emphasized that, Martin Luther King Jr. emphasized that around race, that we poison the church when we force people to hide who they are. And so we are called to do work around that deception as a church in order to move forward. That's a critical piece of the work that needs to be done.
You used the word calling, and I think that's very important. Ministry is not just a profession, an occupation. It is a calling arising from a personal understanding of one's life and actions in the world. And as my final question before we open up to the audience assembled here for some further questions, would be to pose to all of you, how did this event affect your calling? Bishop Breton, did it did it catapult you into further political action, or was that where your life was taking you at that time? And others can answer that as well.
It catapulted me in the sense that I knew I had to continue doing this kind of ministry after I left New Orleans, and I had to keep pursuing it. A few years ago, a young man whom I consider my adopted nephew happened to be reading the materials that I put together about the fire at the upstairs lounge. And before he could finish reading all of them, he was in a Niagara fall of tears coming out of his eyes. And he said, this story has got to be told, and you've got to keep on telling the story. So I'm doing what he told me to do. I'm keeping on telling the story. And I'm 82 years old. I don't get around as easily as I would like to. I don't play tennis anymore. And I'm going to keep on telling the story. And if I have to roll myself in on a rollator, I will tell the story about what happened here, because this is as much a religious and spiritual story as it is a human story, as it is a societal story, as it is a political story. So I'm going to keep on going on this.
I'm going to come up here. I'm sorry. There's another person that should be sitting right here with this group, and that's Father William Richardson. Okay. He thank you. I'm from St. George's Episcopal Church. He was our rector from 53 to 76. He stayed 3 years after the event. He was a very small man that had a big heart and a strong love of God and his understanding of the principles of what being Christian was. And I have his letter. This letter was written June.
Thank you. Actually, that letter is pretty important,
Great.
and it needs to be read.
I don't want to read the whole letter. I just want to say a few words about Father Richardson.
Let me say a comment. For those who may not be aware, St. George's Episcopal Church actually held a small service.
There were 8 people.
Yes. And that was very important because Pastor Bill Richardson, whom she is referencing, decided to do that, and he caught holy hell from his congregation. And he got so, and his bishop, and he got so incensed that he wrote a letter chastising them. And so I think it's important for you to do that. We need you to speak into the microphone.
And if you could go stand where you were back there. Okay. I'm sorry. We're talking about history, and this is history. And he was a little man with a big heart, and he should be here. But he died at 98 in 2007. And so he can't be here today. And I guess I'm appointed. Anyway, that was what I was trying to say. I just wanted to tell you how much his stance, part of his letter, it's out there on the table. Anybody can have a copy. I have plenty of copies. Part of it started off, he had the service on Monday night after the fire, probably a week and a day later, right?
The next night,
Or was it the next night?
wasn't it?
It was on Monday night. I know that Monday, and this letter was written on the 26th. So what day was the fire?
Yeah, that's it.
Right. And he had it for the Reverend Bill Larson and others who died in the worst fire in the city. And the first line says, St. George's is not a private club, but the house of God. So I think that was where he started and where he came from. And he had a very strong conviction that the church was to serve the people that needed him. And that's all I wanted to really say. I just wanted to remember him and not let him be lost because we weren't there. Yes.
I will. I'll keep it short. He is not forgotten. In my documentary Upstairs Inferno, he actually speaks. He's interviewed posthumously. I used a recording, and it talks about his experience, and we pay tribute to him. So he's forever memorialized in the film. So I just want to let you know that. Thank you.
Thank you. It's on.
I certainly stand in awe of your priesthood over the last 50 years, each and every one of you, how you've stood with the people who have suffered, the people who have been so impacted by this terrible thing. We're 50 years later. We're moving into a new era. How are you now going to practice your prophetic side of your ministry?
I'm going to give you all of you the mics for this one.
Well, I'm moving into semi-retirement. I'll be 75 in August, and so I'm just, and as a matter of fact, tomorrow will be my last day at St. Mark's. But still, we will carry the message of God's love, mercy, and grace to all, and just to interact in the lives of folks and speak truth.
What immediately came to mind was there's a World War I monument in City Park, not 2 blocks from my house. And on the monument it says that, from our failing hands we toss the torch of freedom for you to carry. That's probably not exact words, it's very close. And so I think that's from their hands, their faith, their desire to live and be who they are as the LGBTQ community and their allies at the Upstairs Lounge. I think it's our mission to carry on their history, their message, their love, their community, their church, like you said. And it's for us to continue doing that, and not forget it. I think that's what I'm holding on to, and I hope that's what I'm able to do as I continue in my ministry with MCC.
To go back to this question of doing your job, I didn't seize the mic because I've said what I have to say about it is that we are called as a church to do better, to do the church, to care for all of our people. And I'm on a leave of absence right now, so it's easy for me to say that I'm going to call the church to that challenge. I possibly am extending my leave of absence, Rev, but it's easy for me to say when my paycheck and my livelihood does not depend on it. But yes, we have a prophetic call as part of our ministry, and I'm more than willing to continue to share that message, a warning of the spiritual sickness of deception and exclusion.
Likewise, I completely, fully agree. What's also important is exactly what's being done with that camera right there. And 50 years from now, whatever is produced with that camera needs to be available for the people of New Orleans so that they can have that, go back to it, and learn from it. I'm going to keep talking about the Upstairs Lounge fire until probably long after I'm dead. I'll still be talking about it. I'm going to come back and haunt people and teach them about the Upstairs Lounge fire. Because the Upstairs Lounge fire is about people. It's about us. It's about men and women. And I apologize for not mentioning Father Bill Richardson. The day after the fire, he provided a chapel in his parish church to hold a service, and he was chastised for it by the Episcopal bishop. At the beginning of this month, I'm on a month-long bucket trip, and at the beginning of this month, I went to Washington, D.C., and talked with the congregation that I founded. But I also went to the National Cathedral. On February the 2nd, 1971, we were to host a service in St. Stephen and the Incarnation Episcopal Church in Washington, D.C., in the middle of the afternoon, where Troy Perry was going to preach. The Episcopal Bishop of Washington heard about it and closed the door. I got a call from Father Bill Wendt and said, "We can't let you use the church for Troy Perry's to come and preach. But we do have a front porch." And on a bitter cold Sunday, we stood on the front porch and Troy Perry preached, and we even conducted a communion service. And then we went to the National Cathedral and had a pray-in. The pray-in worked, because at the beginning of this month, I went to the National Cathedral, And down in St. Joseph's Chapel is a placard on the wall in honor and memory of Matthew Shepard.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. Mr. Campbell?
My name's David Campbell, and sort of following up what you were just now talking about, I wondered if you have an assessment or a view of what it's like today compared to then, as far as members of LGBT community being more willing to and more accepting in call them mainline churches or whatever you want to call them, but just churches in general, because I know that for me personally, it took about 15 years before I could feel like I could commit to a church, which I ultimately did and became active in it. But I wonder about so many of my LGBT friends, how much change has there been in that regard? Thank you.
Yeah, I can't speak to that 'cause
I mean, I know that Metropolitan Community Church was the first of the LGBTQ, churches in the country. I know we're now spread in over 20 countries around the world with over 230 parishes. A lot of people don't know that either. In fact, my church community didn't know that. After I went to our general conference, I came home and actually got a map of the world and a map of the United States and put a pin in every spot that we had a church so I could show them what our denomination looks like. And I mean, I know that over the years, mainline churches have become more welcoming. The Holy Spirit is finally enlightening them. And so it is interesting. I mean, for MCC to look and say, well, we're not the only LGBT church anymore. And what is our role now? And where do we fit in the midst of all of that? Because the Episcopals can now go to their church because they are welcomed, and wherever else is being welcoming. And so there is a difference. Because they can worship where they grew up or where they was, their roots were. But we know that a lot of people are still, marginalized by the Christian communities. We see it in this world. We see it in our politics. And so there is still a place for us, MCC, to be the voice of God amongst the LGBTQ community. And so, while there is change, there's still a mission for us and still a call for us to do our work. And so that's how I view it. Yes, some people are going to where they were nurtured. And I know LGBTQIA, Catholics that still go to Catholic church, because that's where I had to go. That's part of the way they grew up, and that's where they go. And so, that it's individual, and I think, but I still think MCC has a place, within the mission of God's work in the LGBTQ community. Anybody else?
Okay. All right. I think we have come up against the scourge of time and scheduling, but I do want to thank each of our esteemed panelists for being here today. Thank you. And thank you.